Whichever way you say it.
It's beautiful in Italian.
Okay, I think we may start. Welcome. Welcome to all of you, those who are here in the flesh. Thanks for taking the time to come over to the International Affairs Institute. And thanks also to those who are connecting from afar. We streaming this live on YouTube. And thanks, of course, to our distinguished guests, prominent China experts who have participated in this project and who are here to elaborate a bit on the topics they have been working on for years. And thanks especially to Beatrice Gallelli, my colleague here at EI. She's a China expert, and she's been in charge of carrying out this project. But what is this project about? Today we are going to, before I say that, perhaps I should introduce myself too. I am Riccardo Accaro. I am head of research at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, OII. I'm also head of the Global Access Program, which is the research area in which we deal with the United States, China, Russia, and great power interactions, more broadly speaking. So today, China, and more specifically, we are talking about how China wants us to speak about it, and specifically about certain issues in which China is especially invested. But we are not going to do that. We are not going to speak about those issues the way China wants. On the contrary, and this is the ultimate objective of this project, we are going to put forward fact-based narratives about those issues which China is so much interested in us speaking the way it wants. Those issues, I mean, there are many, but the issues on which this project has been concentrating concern China's relationship with Russia. I cannot think of a more topical issue right now, but also China's Belt and Road initiative in the global south. So the Belt and Road for a while was one of the most debated topics in international debates. Of course, it is this massive collection of infrastructure development initiatives taken by China since 2013, since President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, at the time the One Belt, One Road initiative, as his flagship initiative in foreign policy. I mean, the Belt and Road was and remained pretty much at the forefront of China's foreign policy, at least until COVID struck. Then we have seen some downgrading of the term. I'm not sure about the ambitions, and we are going to find out today. And finally, the treatment of the Uyghurs, which is the Turkic Muslim minority, which mostly inhabits China's western region of Xinjiang, and who have been subjected to special treatment, which is a British understatement for forced signification. And we are also going to look into that. This project, which has been made possible by a grant provided to us by the U.S. mission to Italy. So our thanks go to the U.S. mission to Italy for making this possible. It has resulted in 4 interviews by Beatrice with prominent China experts, 3 of whom are here. 3 of the interviews have been published. The 4th is in the pipeline. The interviews have been produced and published both in English as video interviews and in Italian in the form of podcasts. You can find them all on YAI's website, and as far as the podcasts are concerned, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever other platform you use to download podcasts. And with that, I think I've exhausted my task today, and I'm very happy to pass on the floor to Beatrice, who will introduce the project a bit more deeply than I have to you, and we can finally start having a substantial discussion. Thanks again, and thanks again to all our guests and Beatrice.
All right. Good morning. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you, Riccardo, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. A special thanks, of course, goes to Marzia and all the U.S. Embassy for funding this project and make it possible, actually, and also to our guests. Also for letting me anticipate these events that were supposed to be in June, but I'll be on maternity leave in June, so I couldn't make it. And in the end, we decided to anticipate it. Unfortunately, Maria Repnikova, who is part of the project too, and I will interview her at the end of this month or the beginning of April, couldn't make it. I hope there will be other chance to invite her and join us for in-present events as well. I'd like just to add another piece of information to what just Riccardo said. This is the first event, and tomorrow we're going to have another one, which is a workshop at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, where I also work as assistant professor, in addition to be a China fellow here at IAI. I'd like to spend a few minutes to introduce the reason why we are here and provide a bit of a context of why we should focus more on China's official narratives and communication strategies, especially abroad. We live in a time when strategic communication has become a key instrument in international politics, even more than before, I would say. For instance, information and disinformation, not new in warfare, but the ongoing war in Ukraine has demonstrated how narratives, whether factual or not factual, have a profound impact on the war on the ground. Within the current international circumstances, it can be denied that China is a protagonist in the increasingly contested information domain, and it is also an actor that has spared no effort in telling her side of the story. The story of the war, as well as other stories, including the so-called China story. And here I'm quoting the title of this event because the title, China Story, is drawn from a slogan, Tell China's Story Well and Communicate China's Voice, launched by the current President Xi Jinping on the 19th of August in 2013. Soon after being appointed as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and the President of the People's Republic of China. In his speech at the time, the speech was delivered at the National Propaganda and Ideology Work Conference, so an event meant to be for domestic politics mostly. She called for greater innovation of China's external communication. And this call for action by Chinese president was followed by a debate, which is still ongoing, on how to enhance China's discursive power for those who speak Chinese, 话语权, especially given the challenges of the digital age and the poor results of China's soft power strategies carried out before, so during the previous decade. It is against this backdrop that Chinese political elites have made even greater efforts in crafting narratives and use communication strategies able to provide a positive image of the country. Already in the years following the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, those years saw a kind of renovation of the propaganda tactics and strategies addressing the foreign audience. So, for instance, the first white paper ever released by the Chinese Communist Party, by the Chinese state, was published in 1991. So soon after the crackdown, like 2 years later than the Tiananmen crackdown. Now we are witnessing a new round of renovation of China's official communication strategies and techniques, and perhaps even contents. So it is even more urgent to understand these narratives, the underlying ideologies, tactics, and aims. To do so, I couldn't be happier to have today here with me three prominent and leading scholars in the field of China's history, China's public diplomacy, and China's political communication. I'll start from the right, from Marina Rudiak, who is an assistant professor at Heidelberg University. She's a sinologist working on the intersections of China studies and international development. Her research focuses on China as a global development actor, specifically China's foreign aid and development lending policy, the implication of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the China in Central Asia and Africa. She is also interested in the political ideology of Chinese Communist Party and coded communication in Chinese politics. Marina is the co-founder of the Decoding China Dictionary, which is an extremely useful open source. You can watch it online, understand a lot more about the meaning attached to specific keywords in the Chinese political context. And then, starting from the left, we have Una Alexandra Bedzina-Cherenkova. Please accept my apologies for the bad pronunciation, who is the head of the Political Science PhD program and China Studies Center at Riga Stradins University, head of the Asia program at Latvian Institute of International Affairs, a member of CERN and the European think tank network on China. Una is a political scientist and a China scholar, and has written extensively on China's politics, political communication, EU-China relations, as well as Russian-China relations. I warmly suggest you to read her recent published books about China-Russian relations. Last but not least, we have James Millward, who is professor of intersocietal history at Georgetown University, teaching Chinese, Central Asian, world history. His expertise includes Qing Empire, the Silk Road, Eurasia roots, and music in history, and historical and contemporary Xinjiang, the northwestern region, which nowadays, of course, is at the center of the international debate for the violence perpetrated by the Chinese state against the non-Han population, especially, as Ricardo mentioned, Uyghurs. And if you want to understand more about the history of Xinjiang, you must read his Eurasian Crossroad, The History of Xinjiang. So today, to structure the discussion, I thought that perhaps it would be useful to start from a few keywords which are crucial in China's official narratives and widely employed by China's official and politicians in telling their top-down version of the story. So the first one, I'd like to start with James Millward, who has written extensively, as I mentioned, on Xinjiang. And of course, what is going on in Xinjiang is mostly is widely defined as a human rights violation. Human rights have become in the debate between EU, China, and US, China, has become a kind of contested concept, because on the one hand, we had the Chinese authorities who are accused of human rights violation against Uyghurs and other nationalities as well in the Xinjiang region. On the other hand, Chinese officials defend themselves by saying that they are providing security and development to the people in that region. So specifying that development is the most fundamental of the human rights. The definition of human rights has become so extremely contested. So my question has to do with how to make sense of this debate. And do you think that the effort in molding a kind of different meaning or a different definition of human rights by the Chinese political elite is the outcome of this new proactive approach by the Chinese leaders under Xi Jinping? Or it has always been there for decades, but we just ignore it and dismiss it as like Chinese empty propaganda?
Thank you for the introduction and for that first question. I'd say, so looking at what's been going on in the Xinjiang region or the Uyghur region for the last several years, and particularly from Europe or from the United States or Australia or from places where we have free access to media, there's a very stark difference between the Chinese story from official sources and what we can read in a multitude of independent media. Right? We don't have to listen to one government; we can see it in, so, and that of course adds a lot of credibility to the story. So, from the point of view of, let's just call it the West, it seems to be that China is flatly denying what is very obvious, what we can literally see from space, satellite imagery of these camps and other things like that, what we hear from many witnesses and people who've gotten from the camps and so on. From that point of view, and I felt this myself, it seems like a very clumsy information campaign, actually, one that's not really working. It's not getting much friction. But I think if you look more broadly and include countries in the global South and many recipients of Belt and Road aid and loans and other countries like this, there is much more support, or at least, publicly voiced support, whether backed by belief or not, doesn't seem to matter. But you see delegations of various countries going to the region, even Islamic countries saying that, well, this is all in the name of security, it's not an abuse against Islam, and so on and so forth. So China has actually been able to rally those kinds of countries around it, including in key parts of the UN, whenever things come up for a vote in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly, even. If it's a matter of states versus states in a quantitative vote, China wins, right? In terms of just numbers like that, right? So this is a sign of, I think, there are a couple of things that are going on. One, as I mentioned before, is the economic influence side with Belt and Road, which perhaps we'll talk about more. But there's also been an effort to redefine what human rights means and to redefine the norms of human rights in ways that reflect China's approach to human rights all along, really, for decades, but which now, for the first time, are being internationalized more than they have been in the past. And we can see one of the ways in which they're being internationalized in changes to and resolutions that China has gotten passed in the UN, in the Human Rights Council, that stress certain Chinese points about what human rights are. So as everyone here has probably heard, one of the most important principles in China's foreign policy is this principle of non-interference, right? Which of course makes their position on Ukraine rather difficult to reconcile with reality, and likewise with Taiwan, but of course they have workarounds for that. We'll leave that aside. So non-interference is sort of a key first-tier principle. And what that really means is that when it comes to issues about human rights, the state always comes first. And China thinks of rights as vested in the state. They talk about rights as collective, much more than as individual. And the idea that rights are something that are inherent to individual personhood, and therefore non-governmental outside actors and observers should be talking about rights of anyone in China. That's something that they have always condemned and refused to admit. Now, it used to be that they would do this as a shield to criticism about treatment of dissidents in China, about the treatment of the Tiananmen or the Tiananmen incident, or whatever the issue was. And it was kind of a sort of rhetorical wall around China itself. But through the UN and other international institutions and this narrative that it's being exported and policed, for example, by putting pressure on corporations, putting pressure on sports teams, through academic institutions and various influence like that, they're beginning to change this narrative and these norms more broadly. And in particular, good, I'm glad it's coming through. I once had to give a whole talk where that echo, I had to hear myself 10 seconds later. The idea of development and raising standards of living as a justification for needing to maintain security like this. This is a particular part of the argument that I think has been more successful. And it's a false argument, I think, because for one thing, you don't, at the very least, you don't need to sacrifice freedom of speech and individual freedom of movement and religious practice and to speak your own language to bring development. Probably it's the case that, in fact, those things, sacrificing those things makes development harder, right? And as it's currently happening, forcibly or through coercion, proletarianizing an entire rural population is not best practice development either, right? There's other things to do before you go through and take all the farmers and force them to work in the factory, right? But nevertheless, that part of the argument is, I think, beginning to take hold and certainly is arguably influential in the global South.
Thank you very much. And linked to the human rights violation in Xinjiang, I'd like to ask Marina about the second of our keywords of today, which is multilateralism, because the Xinjiang issue and human rights violation in the region has become, is at the core of the increasing tensions between China and Europe. And Chinese authorities often blame the EU, the European Union, of blindly following the US, especially for issues, of course, regarding human rights. But in the other side of this so-called, what can we say, a discursive coin, is that China instead is promoting the true multilateralism compared to the false multilateralism, which is in Chinese official narrative is defined as a U.S.-led multilateralism. So my question is, what are the principles at the heart of China's definition of multilateralism, and what are the differences from the European understanding of this crucial term?
Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Very important, very fascinating question, and I will try kind of also to link a little bit to what James spoke about. Like, first of all, in the official discourse and the external discourse, we see Xi Jinping personally and many other government stakeholders reiterating China's commitment to multilateralism. And I just took out one quote by Xi in his address to the AIIB annual meeting in 2020, which is very representative and has been repeated in a similar way in many instances. And that is, China has always supported multilateralism, practiced multilateralism, and worked with other countries around the world to pursue development in a spirit of openness, cooperation, and mutual benefit. Sounds nice, has been picked up by many Western stakeholders, like, for example, at the World Economic Forum in 2021, where Xi Jinping again spoke about multilateralism. Klaus Schwab picked it up and praised Xi Jinping for his firm commitment to multilateralism, where we could talk about transfer of narratives and unreflected picking up of narratives. What it actually means is, when we start digging deeper, especially since late 2021, we find that, what we as China scholars do mostly, we spend a lot of time on the first page of the People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece. And this is where you find, the main discursive terms. And what happened after the reapproachment between the Biden administration and the European Union on China was that suddenly a new term appeared, and this term was true multilateralism. So if you look at the headlines of the People's Daily, there's a lot of multilateralism since 2017, but suddenly since 2021, late 2021, there is a peak at true multilateralism. And what it means is, and then I'm going to quote the Foreign Minister Wang Yi in his meeting with his Irish counterpart, Simon Coveney. Wang Yi said the so-called rules set by a few countries or groups of countries are not true multilateralism. So what the narrative of the Chinese government is that the rule-based international order is not true multilateralism. That it is a set of rules propagated by the United States and by the US allies. The United States tries to impose on the rest of the world. While in contrast, China is practicing true multilateralism with the intention of construct a community of shared future for mankind, where
Yeah, but perhaps not for the streaming.
Better? Okay, let's hope it works. Yeah, so where the Chinese government said we are supporting the G20 multilateral initiative and we are going to negotiate with the African countries bilaterally. Just to maybe, if it's okay, make a very small bridge to Chinese visions of the world order and James, because yesterday, no, the day before yesterday, there was a very interesting tweet by Hua Chunying, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who compared Ukraine and Taiwan. I'm just going to quote it. The Chinese people have every right to ask, why does the United States talk at length about respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine while disrespecting China's sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Taiwan question? Why does the US ask to China not to provide weapons to Russia while it keeps selling arms to Taiwan in violation of the August 17th communique? Yeah. So this is kind of, there you see how I don't like to use the word twisting because it's judgmental, and as scholars probably we should be judging more, be less judging but more descriptive. But but this is, I think, especially, if you start following the tweets by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's a brilliant case study of how the shaping of the global discourse and shaping and reshaping of terms is taking place.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah, I think so. Okay, we are getting closer to a very crucial issue, which is the war in Ukraine. And a pillar of China's side of the story about the war is that the US, through NATO, has putting oil on the fire, fueling the fight instead of working for peace. So the key word I'd like to ask Una to talk about is the Cold War mentality. Because according to China's narrative, China's official narrative, this is done by the US because the Biden administration is driven by what they define as a Cold War mentality. And this standpoint was reiterated by the China's foreign minister, Qin Gang, 2 days ago at the press conference. When he said that if the US keeps going down the wrong road, it will inevitably cause conflict and confrontation. So my question is, we talked already in the interview about China's official narrative about Ukraine. And my question is whether you see any substantial changes in the narratives on the war crafted by Chinese authorities over the past few months. Is there anything that you think is particularly surprising in the development of China's narrative on the war?
We keep stealing your microphone, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here. So I want to thank Beatrice and Ricardo for having us, and I especially. I want to say that Beatrice is one of the leading voices in the world on keyword analysis in China, and I want to say that this is actually an excellent approach that has proven itself to be very relevant. And I will say a couple of words about this later. Actually, when we're looking at the information domain, the keyword approach in China's case has proven to deliver excellent results. And you're one of the trailblazers here, because actually in 2018, I had no idea who Beatrice was. We'd never met. And then I come across this paper that's called Doing Things with Metaphors. Do you remember you wrote that? Yeah, it was called Doing Things with Metaphors in Contemporary China, analyzing the use of creative metaphors in the discourse on the Chinese dream. And a very relevant paper up until this day. So why keywords matter, especially in the Chinese case? Well, first of all, the official discourse is full of them. There's just these phrases, these formulas that keep coming up. They appear and then they fade out, but they carry certain meanings beyond their translation. Some of them are presented as and there's another telltale sign that it's a relevant keyword. They are never what they seem. So let me tell you more. First of all, some of them are presented as traditional phrases, but once you start digging, you realize they're not. They are repurposed for a new meaning. They look traditional in form. They're a quote of something, but they're used in a completely different meaning. Some seem absolutely socialist, but actually Marx would probably turn in his grave when hearing those. So again, a repurposing, an adding of a new meaning of these keywords. Some are new, but once you start looking, actually they're not that new. So the way around, and some of them are attributed to a certain leader, but once you start digging, you realize no, actually it's older than that. So, and the number one characteristic of Chinese keywords is that they're never translated properly. Not even in the official discourse. And I would say that, of course, again, the task that you gave me to talk a little bit about to give up the mindset, the Cold War mentality. Well, of course, the word is thinking mindset, but it's not mentality actually, but it's being translated as mentality. So what do we see surrounding this? Of course, it's always aimed at the U.S. as being this actor. The critique of the U.S. as being this actor that is bound by Cold War mentality. That's the official narrative. That's the official story. This phrase comes together with different kind of additions, add-ons in the official discourse. Sometimes you would see Cold War mentality plus bloc confrontation. That has been fading out. Now you see Cold War mentality plus U.S. hegemony, Cold War mentality plus abuse of sanctions, and something that Marina just reminded me that was more popular a couple of years ago, but now it's fading out, Cold War mentality plus zero sum. So it's always against the U.S. But the earliest phrases we can see through the databases is even 1996, but of course it's sporadic. And so it's been picking up pace since the trade war, and especially since Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But what is new then? What is new about this Cold War mentality then? The biggest development is that instead of just calling, that Xi Jinping, instead of just calling for other countries to stop doing something, he's come up with a counteroffer of sorts. He's come up with the Global Security Initiative. And this is where I want to quote Beatrice again from another article, but basically it's about creating a community and how Chinese discursive actors create a community, and by invoking a sense of communality and basically by downplaying distinctions, but of course it always involves the exclusion of others. So it's the us versus them by emphasizing the differences with the others. So let me quote a little bit from the paper that came out recently on the Global Security Initiative. Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed the Global Security Initiative, calling on countries to adapt to the profoundly changing international landscape in the spirit of solidarity and address the complex and intertwined security challenges with a win-win mindset. The GSI aims to eliminate the root causes of international conflicts, improve global security governance, encourage joint international efforts to bring more stability and certainty to a volatile and changing era, and promote durable peace and development in the world. So a lot like the quote that Marina gave you. So it's kind of a message of inclusion. But at the end of the day, this document also contains the critique of the Cold War mentality. Interestingly, under the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. So this is and I think if we had to put a name to another kind of an alternative name to today's conversation, I would say false dilemmas. You outlined, James, the false dilemma of development versus kind of national characteristics. Marina outlined some false dilemmas of multi versus bilateralism that China's been putting out, or rather the false dilemma of China's view on multilateralism and the existing international order, right? As if it can't accommodate that. And the false dilemma that I want to outline here is closer to the one that Marina outlined, the idea that on one hand, the UN is something that is being quoted and something it's a fallback on concept, but on the other hand, you have to kind of choose which security outlook do you follow. And so this point 3 of the GSI context paper, sorry, the concept paper, is, let me quote, it's going to be a short one, I promise. The Cold War mentality, unilateralism, bloc confrontation, and hegemonism contradict the spirit of the UN Charter and must be resisted and rejected. And yet I want to argue, so this sounds very assuring and kind of from the Chinese perspective, and we already see some leaders taking the plane to Beijing and signing off on this. We see Alexander Lukashenko, right, talking about that, where do I sign? This sounds like a great idea, whatever this means, but I want to be a part of this. So, and of course, there's going to be more. So within the coming months, we're going to see a long line of leaders doing similar things. But the big issue here is that even though it projects a sense of commonality, that is actually the opposite of what we receive and how we perceive this initiative. Because at the end of the day, it is about blocks. It is about block building. And this is where I want to take this conversation to Ukraine, as Beatrice already kind of outlined that I should, that even though China is trying its best to not be perceived as an open supporter of Russia, but the fact that this most recent narrative of global security initiative, of this counter, of the need to present a countercurrent to the US-led security architecture, including in Europe, right? And the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan are basically showing that China is kind of in Russia's corner. At least in my part of the world, I come from the Baltic states, it comes up in the polls very clearly that China's position on Russia and these kind of anti-NATO, anti-Western positions, including in Europe. So very important distinction. When China was criticizing and critiquing the US security architecture in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, okay, that's not ideal, but it's kind of understandable. You know, it's their backyard, it's the big countries, they're realists, whatever. But they've shifted gears. They've moved to talk about the US security infrastructure in Europe, in my backyard, and that's different. And so what is the problem that we get once with this new narrative of China, this counter push to what they call Cold War mentality, is that the GSI narrative is running directly counter the founding story of our sovereignty and kind of our independence as northeastern European countries. So China kind of has put itself into the other camp for us. And I would say this is one of the big surprises for me, because I expected GSI to be, this global security initiative, to be more, to kind of prevent and expect this outcome, that it can hurt China's interests in Central and Eastern Europe, for example. And it can hurt China's narrative of, actually, you know what, we are a strategic partner of Ukraine, and this is all very sad, and we want the war to stop. I think that the way that global security initiative is worded right now, there's just this one goal of countering the US, blaming the US of Cold War mentality, but everything else is forgotten. And I think that's a very good illustration of the fact that at the end of the day, Xi Jinping's foreign policy has blind spots when it comes to smaller, to medium and small powers. And I think that is going to be his downfall in terms of foreign policy sooner or later. Thank you.
So, thank you all. Very interesting presentations. Beatrice has give me permission to ask the first questions. I have just a couple of questions. One to James and the other one to Una and Marina. So the Uyghur issue, okay? So this is about full signification or whatever terms you deem most appropriate. But my question is not so much about what it is, but why is this happening? Why is this happening now? I mean, in these past few years, is this the natural outcome of a process started long ago? Is it about the Uyghurs as a minority, or is it about the state, the state's necessity from the point of view of the party to control all parts of its population? So is it about capacity? Is it about political decision? So these would be my questions. And to Una and Marina, my question concerns this idea of true multilateralism and opposition to Cold War mentality, or what is it, the exact translation of the Chinese term? Mindset. Which is actually probably more accurate, I think. Anyways, this at times even comical attachment to true multilateralism by the Chinese. Does it come out of a genuine conviction? Is it something the Chinese know, deliberately pursue because they know that wins points in the global south? Is it therefore a part of a deliberate anti-Western campaign? And does it stop there? Or do you think that the Chinese will be capable of elaborating that into something more concrete and more Chinese-centric? Sort of a multilateralism for China, but China finally risen to global power, or even first global power status.
Thank you, Ricardo, for those questions. So you ask whether it's a culmination. What's been going on in Xinjiang for the last several years is a culmination of a long-term process, or a more recent shift? Is it a question of political capacity emerging, or some other reason? I would say it's both a culmination and also a disjuncture. It's a culmination in the sense that if we look at it most simply, the Uyghur region since 1949 is a colonial situation. This is a word that China scholars have not really used until recently, but we're using it much more. I actually use it going back into the 18th century when the region was part of the Qing Empire, and through the 19th century, there was a process of Han settlement, Han Chinese moving out into the region. Very parallel to, I'm hearing.
Is it working?
Hey, Mike?
I'm hearing in the room, but is it streaming? It's good? Okay, we're good. Expansion of population out into these frontiers, very similar to the expansion of European peoples across the United States. And actually the amount of territory that went from being not populated by Chinese to being populated by Chinese from the 18th through the 19th and 20th century is roughly comparable to that of the US west of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's actually a very similar process to what went on, and it involved displacement of indigenous peoples and so on. After 1949, though, in both Tibet and Xinjiang, there were very few Han Chinese people in either of those places. And the PRC has actively promoted, they call it development, opening the West. Again, the US used all of those same euphemisms for what we now call settler colonialism. So it's very clear, right? And I'm not saying this delegitimizes sovereignty of the regions, whether Xinjiang belongs to China or Tibet belongs to China or not. That's not really the question here. The question is how the people are being treated and so on. In that sense, it's a continuation. But the PRC initially recognized the problem of optics to be recreating the ancien regime of the Qing Empire, just the way the Soviet Union recognized the problem of recreating the Tsarist Empire and so then put it on a different footing with nationalities policies, creating all of the republics and so on. And the PRC, that's why the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or the Tibetan Autonomous Region are called autonomous. It's not because they really are autonomous or ever have been, it's because the Chinese Communist Party wants to say that they're autonomous so that they don't look like imperial conquests, right? So what's happened in the last few years, though, is that a new narrative has come up, and it's a kind of delayed reaction to the breakup of the Soviet Union, which of course was very alarming to the Chinese Communist Party, who believes that the nationalities policies of the Soviet Union were principally responsible for its breakup, as opposed to economic problems and things like that. And that to the extent that Chinese nationalities policies or ethnicity policies were built on a similar model, then they too could lead to this, to centripetal forces, centrifugal forces and breakup of China. And that, of course, is the biggest fear of, and loss of Chinese Communist Party control. And so in certain academic circles, in think tank circles, among party thinkers, starting really in the early 2000s and especially since the 2010s, discussion about a new approach to nationalities began. One which would no longer celebrate diversity, to use our modern terms, but would rather emphasize the unity. And so one of the keywords in Chinese that has been around forever but is now being used much more is this idea of Zhonghua, which is one of the various words that means Chinese in Chinese. It's not referencing the country, it's not referencing the Han ethnicity, it's a umbrella term for Chinese, similar actually to European words of Chinese, which can mean so many different characteristics of, political, ethnic, cultural, culinary, right? Zhonghua can mean all of those things. So they've been stressing that and kind of flipping what had been an old narrative that the modern Chinese national identity emerged from a crucible of modern times under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to become a strong nation. They're flipping that around to say that the Chinese nationality has been there all along from ancient times. And so that, and when, the historical narrative claims that Xinjiang has been part of China since the 2nd century BC and so on, they're simultaneously saying that the peoples, Uyghurs and other peoples of these regions, have been Chinese, or their bloodlines have been linked to the bloodlines of the Zhonghua people from those, actually referencing quasi-racial or even racial kind of reasons here. So it's a very new argument. It's an old argument. It's a very 19th century kind of argument saying everyone's all the same racial stock. We've all been Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek said this 100 years ago. And this is underlying Xi Jinping's new approach. It's there, you can see aspects of it and hints of it in even the China Dream narrative, which is stressing the same aspect of Chineseness. And so that ideologically underpins and almost leads to this acutely assimilative approach, which we've seen taken on. So that's not the only reasons for it. The Chinese officials themselves, of course, say that the terrorism was very bad and therefore something needed to be done, and have actually argued that that meant 1/10 of the population needed to be interned for years and language wiped out and all these other things, which doesn't make a lot of sense from a realistic point of view. That's their first tier narrative. But I think the broader argument is that everyone is Chinese, everyone has been Chinese, they just don't know it, and therefore they need to be re-engineered, their identity needs to be re-engineered to make that the case.
Is it streaming? Okay. Yeah. I find the question about genuine convictions really fascinating because, of course, we can't really get into the people's heads, but strategic empathy is a very important concept. Empathy not to be equal with sympathy, but to try to understand the Chinese government kind of, in ways how it sees the world. And I find it helpful to look at, first, of course, what Xi Jinping is saying, but also thinking about who is shaping his ideology, who writes for him, and then we end up with Wang Huning, and looking at what we have in terms of his writing and his view on the world, and just to try and take this seriously. And linking to what James just said on the perception of the collapse of the Soviet Union, what is common to the Chinese Communist Party and to Russia today, or to Xi and to Putin, is that both regard the collapse of the Soviet Union as the biggest strategy of the 20th century. And if you think about what were the formative years, what happened during the formative years of China's current leadership, it was the Cultural Revolution. It was the period of huge instability. So stability seems to be the most important thing for the Chinese government, and it transpires through everything. It transpires through the domestic discourse. It transpires now more than ever through the security development nexus, and linking the Global Security Initiative with the Global Development Initiative, which was announced a year earlier, and saying that, well, development is the highest human right, and development, first of all, needs security. And then if you look at the whole discourse around true multilateralism and the signaling towards both the global south, but also let's talk about kind of the Ukraine war or the Eastern European countries. The position paper on the United States and the hegemony that came out last week, right? I'm not messing it up. Basically argues that it's the US that has been stirring up color revolutions to promote its hegemonic agenda. If you take this serious, then all the independence movements in Eastern Europe have been stirred by the US. If you take this serious, then Zelensky is not a legitimate president, but actually somebody who's been brought in by the Americans because of the color revolutions. So, and it's not really something the people want. People want stability and development. So this is kind of one aspect of it. And the other one is, and it links a little bit to what Una said, and this is the whole endorsement thing, and getting other countries, the global south, but everybody else, to endorse and to agree on the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. And I think we have to see how it plays out for the GSI. But what I found fascinating, for the first report on the progress of the Global Development Initiative, published by the think tank China International Development, CIKD, China Knowledge Center on International Development. So the early harvest for the Global Development Initiative was a listing of who endorsed that. And it's like, the China ASEAN has endorsed, and the SCO has endorsed, and FOCAC has endorsed, and whatnot. Why is this important? And I found a paper by Giovanni Andronino very helpful, who wrote about the BRI and why China wanted Italy to endorse the BRI. Because through endorsement, especially on development issues, China can position itself as an alternative great power without challenging the hegemon directly in areas where the hegemon is strong, like military power, but rather say, we are the ones who really, for the people, we are the ones who care about development, development needs security, and we are putting all these things on the table, and we're getting endorsed by the majority of the world. I don't know, maybe not anymore. I leave that to you. Yeah, but this this just this projection and the relevance of it and the relevance of the whole rhetoric is something we really should not lose sight of, because we easily dismiss it as, it's just words, it's just rhetoric. My Chinese students dismiss it as just rhetoric, but it's not.
Yes, just quickly, dismissing something as just words was something we were seeing in Russia since the year 2000, and it turned out to be more than words, right? It turned out that words do have a certain a big hold over people. So I agree with Marina. I just everything you said, there's completely, but I just want to ask this to take on the second part of your question, Ricardo, whether something more concrete and what's China-centric, what's going to come out of it, right? And I think what already is coming out of it is that China has positioned itself as a stakeholder, as someone to be reckoned with, even though we have no idea, A, whether they have any sway over Putin at all, right? Whether Xi Jinping even has the power to call Putin and say, you know what, it's time to get out of Ukraine. I don't think so. I honestly don't believe that. Second of all, whether he would like to do that, right? We have no idea. And yet, somehow, when we imagine the table where people are sitting, where the stakeholders are sitting, talking about the future of Ukraine, China's there. So I think that is the first step, that in our minds right now, in a war in Europe, China has positioned itself to be a stakeholder somehow. And we're going to see more of that. And I think that's the first step towards something more concrete, at least in their strategic objectives.
Just to finger on this, Una. Here in Italy, I've often listened to. There is an opinion. I don't know if it is the opinion of the majority, but I've heard it quite enough, especially on TV, that when discussing the war in Ukraine, people tend to fall into the trap of thinking who are the winners, who are the losers of the war, and a few people, especially journalists based in China, constantly come up with the idea that China is actually the one, or is going to be the one country that will come out best out of the situation, which to me contradicts a bit the empirical evidence of China being now more attached, or better, of Russia being now more of a burden than an actual asset for China, because Russia is weaker politically, is potentially more unstable politically, is weaker militarily. It has been isolated, so it is perhaps a more dependent partner, but also a less influential partner. And also the Europeans and the Americans have come closer, not just from Russia, but almost by default on China too. And unity between Europe and America is something the Chinese really don't like. So I was wondering whether what you have just said is actually confirmation that yes, China has gained because of the war, or whether my initial impressions are still valid and China has lost something actually.
Can I quickly take that? Yeah. So, yeah, thanks. I would say that just like in any situations, the calculation is kind of wins, gains versus losses, right? And it's a multitude of factors on that spreadsheet that the Chinese have, I would imagine, in terms of this situation. And certainly everything that you've outlined is true. I mean, Putin ended up strengthening NATO. China has been trying to drive a wedge in the and has been quite happy with the whole strategic autonomy discourse in Europe and the American, let's return within our own waters, confines, logic. And here you go. Putin has put that to bed, basically, right? But at the same time, China, as an opportunistic rising power, is seeing, okay, what can we do with this? And that's the play. By inserting itself into the conversation, it's trying to make the best out of a situation, which can go either way.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, economically, China is winning because it's replacing all the European and American products that have withdrawn from the Russian market, and it's getting ready to rebuild the Ukraine. If you look at the 12-point plan, the last sentence is China is ready to support the reconstruction of Ukraine when things are over. And if you're honest, I mean, who else has the capacity to do that, to rebuild all the infrastructure? So in the end, China is going to win on that, I'm afraid.
I think it's time to open to a Q&A session. Yeah, there's already a question.
Yes.
Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes,
please?
of course. My name is Thomas Koenigs, and I work at the Netherlands Embassy here in Rome. I would like to ask a question specifically to Italy, maybe to, it's best to you, Beatrice, but if any of the other speakers feel the need to answer, be my guest, of course. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on the effect of Chinese narratives on the discourse in Italian society, and if there is a role for the Chinese diaspora here or not.
Do you want me to ask my question now and then have the panel? Okay. My name's Ron Linden. I am University of Pittsburgh political science professor, retired, and I'm here as a visiting professor at Sapienza. I want to thank the panelists for terrific presentation, especially Marina, your comment about Ukraine and rebuilding. It is often forgotten that before the war, Ukraine and China economic relations were dramatically improving. In fact, Zelensky said, Ukraine will be China's bridge to Europe. Things, and for all the right reasons, and I imagine that will come back again. But the question I want to pose has something to do with rhetoric and something to do with the topics you touched on. Recently, the Japanese foreign minister made an extraordinary statement in which he said, what is Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. He was clearly referring to a Chinese posture with regard to Taiwan. My question is that bellicose rhetoric that the Chinese will simply brush off? Will they react to that? Is it different? Is it something that should alarm us? Thank you.
Shall I answer first and then we will continue with the questions? So perhaps it's going to be a little bit easier. Okay, talking about the effects of narratives among the Italian population, I wouldn't say that they are winning at the moment. Of course, there have been a few attempts to spread China's side of the story, so to speak, through Italian media and like through collaboration between China's official media and Italian media. But so far as I know, they haven't been successful. And I'm saying so because I was part of a research project, Una was part of it too, about the perception of China and of Chinese people in different European countries. And the results of the survey show that basically the image of China has worsened over the past few years, especially after COVID. And when it comes to the Chinese community, of course, Italy hosts one of the largest Chinese community in Italy, but we should also never forget the Chinese community is quite heterogeneous inside. So we have at the same time first, second, third, and fourth generation of Chinese here. Some of them speak Chinese, some of them not. When it comes to the Chinese community who still speak Chinese, and they often don't speak a very good Italian, they listened to the directive, so to speak. And it was quite clear in terms of when what happened during the first wave of COVID-19. We saw like Chinese shops closing even before the lockdown by the Italian government. So it was a kind of there was an action by the, I think, Chinese authorities asking them to shut down the activities for security reasons. But then when we also should also keep in mind that it also depends on what the narrative are. I mean, haven't done research on that, but I guess that the perception of the official narratives on different issues may be different according to whether they are first, second, third, or fourth generation, or and of the topic of the narrative in itself. Yeah, who wants to start answering the second question?
I mean, as you know, I quoted in the beginning the post by Hua Chunying. I mean, the Chinese government is very insistent on making clear that Taiwan is not Ukraine because Taiwan is part of China. Or it has been so far, because this actually comparing the delivery of weapons from the US to Taiwan and China to Russia kind of changes the picture a little bit. I mean, the Taiwan scenario is the biggest question mark, I think, for us all, and none of us will be able, you know, to say what is going to happen. But the risks are probably higher than they ever were, because we are in a security dilemma, and it's just pushing itself to a point where we may arrive at a situation nobody really wanted, which is probably comparable with World War I. So the risk is unfortunately there, I would say.
I have this. So, you know, one aspect of the Taiwan question is similar to what I was talking about before, as a shift in how the People's Republic of China treats these territorial issues, treats issues of ethnic difference, and so on. The earlier approach, I mentioned autonomous regions, right? But of course, Hong Kong as a special economic zone, the idea of one country, two systems, right? All of these show a great flexibility and actually quite a creative approach to seeding, or they wouldn't call it this, but different types of sovereignty. Ceding to legal autonomy, tax autonomy, things like this, to different enclaves, right? For political reasons, for reasons of dealing with the fact that there's a former empire that they want to control, and they can't simply control it all, right? So that's one of the common links between Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, has been an earlier approach which was quite flexible, and now we're seeing the loss of that flexibility, right? And so Hong Kong, pull it in, new security law, reneging on the basic law and the deal that had been made with Britain in '97, completely throwing the idea of one country, two systems out the window, which has great effects on the people of Taiwan, and we've seen this in the polls there. No one really supports reunification hardly at all in Taiwan anymore, whereas that used to be, there was a significant percentage of the people, and the Kuomintang party more did support that. So I think there's a possible interpretation that Xi Jinping is making a series of very large mistakes with this change. You can also see it as, seven-dimensional chess, and what is the really big game here too. But it's also possible to see it as, a series of big errors, in part because he's isolated and autocratic, and is in a way being fooled by his own new sets of narratives. I think it would be perhaps I think we shouldn't accept that explanation on its own. I think there's more here to it, and there are structural reasons and others. But I think it is, there is this big problem, I think, from the Chinese point of view, approaching these issues from the Chinese point of view, that they have lost a very useful set of approaches to these issues, or they've thrown them away.
Good morning. I'm Carlo Marino. I'm a correspondent from Italy and Vatican of the European News Agency. I'd like to put you a question concerning the agreement between China and Vatican, People's Republic of China and Vatican. It was signed in 2018, and it's a secret agreement. Do you know what is the narrative of China concerning this agreement?
Good morning. Thank you for the fascinating discussion. I'm Tracy Reid. I'm from the Australian Embassy. My question is one that you touched on earlier in the presentation about the use and manipulation of the English language. I'm really interested to understand a bit more about the process. Do these concepts start in the Chinese language and are then projected through English and mastery, I would suggest, of the English language? And how does that play out in other global languages? I'd be really fascinated in any insights you might have on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for on Vatican. I'm so sorry, I do not know, and I hope maybe Beatrice knows something. But and that's actually extremely interesting because Vatican has a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, right? So what was it there? A secret agreement, yeah, probably. And the Chinese Catholics are not under Vatican, right? Also, from what I remember, yeah. So, to the question on languages, actually, up until so I did a lot of research on Hu Jintao's decade and how these keywords were, and it really seemed like a very clumsy situation where they would originate and they were clever and funny and good in Chinese, and even the characters were, would interplay. But when you translated it into English, it's just completely different. The classic example of China's peaceful rise. Oh my God, right? Hu Jintao thought that it was everybody's, yay, China is peaceful, and everybody's, no, China wants to rise, right? And then, so there was, so in Hu, what I'm trying to say is that in Hu Jintao, up until the late Hu Jintao era, there was a very strong disconnect, because we also know that a lot of these things, they're meant to service the domestic discourse. And they only make it out, as a kind of a secondary result of these things. But during Xi Jinping, it changed. That's when, I think that even China Dream was one of the first concepts that doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, it's not like the others, but it does sound very Western. So you kind of immediately understand. So they started started thinking about how these things look in English. And just to give you an anecdote on how does it play out in other languages, when China takes a look at a certain region and starts to boost relationship with this region, there's immediately training programs in the languages of this region. We saw that with the 16+1, when immediately training courses were established at Chinese universities, including the Beijing Beiyai, how do you call Beiyai? Thank you. Yes, Beijing International Studies University on these languages, including Latvian, for example. And one of the tasks that the students would have is to translate, to see whether these concepts sound okay. So that's an anecdote. So but at the end of the day, this doesn't go very far, especially in the smaller languages, especially in the languages where you don't have China Radio International operating, you don't have Xinhua, is that at the end of the day, it's basically machine translation into the local languages. So it doesn't trickle down.
Okay, so I'll add one small thing, and I'm sure Beatrice, who has done a lot of translation, will add another layer to that. So translation of discourse is nothing new. It has been going on since China, the communist government started publishing the back then Peking Review, and then later Beijing Review, which has been kind of the official English language magazine to explain the Chinese Communist Party to the foreigners. And the sinologist Jeremy Barmy called this phenomenon actually translated China. So these official translations are part of the propaganda apparatus, and it's also why it's so important actually to look at the original discourse, because they are used strategically to shape certain images. Whether successful or not is another question. But they are not really suited to understand what is happening inside the party. They transmit how the party wants to be perceived by the world. And if we look, for example, at documents that exist both in English and in Chinese and official English translations, be it white papers or be it articles in the party journal Jiushi, Seeking Truth, where you would have excerpts, for example, by Xi Jinping's speeches, it's very often that elements that are present in Chinese are missing, or whether things are mistranslated. And Christian Schwermann, who's a German sinologist, he took the Xi Jinping book, Governance of China or Governing China. I don't know if he did all the ones, but he actually compared the original with the German translation, which was done officially by the Central Translation Compilation Bureau, and found kind of a lot of mismatches and a lot of really reshaping the narrative and trying to convey things in a different way that they were done in Chinese. So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is just to stress that we really need people who can decode the original Chinese discourse, because if we rely on official translations, we basically we rely on propaganda, and that's what it is.
We need you.
Yeah, I can add a couple of words on that, because I did a bit of research on the translation strategies behind the white papers on Xinjiang. Basically, we were talking about that yesterday. And then I found that it's extremely interesting, because they have I make an example, in the Chinese version, you usually have the metaphor of the family for describing the relation among the various nationalities. And this metaphor is particularly instrumental in the Chinese context, saying we are all members of the Chinese family. So who would dare to go against this idea of a united family, promoting separatism and so on. This metaphor wasn't used in the English version, when you have instead the use of the present perfect. So Xinjiang it was not portrayed as part of a family, but it's portrayed as a part of a territory which has always been part of China. So, and it was, of course, pushing on the principle of non-interference. So Xinjiang is part of China, and you have to not mess it up. So you cannot, it's not it's out of your business, basically. The process of translation is quite a top-down control process. Tanina Zappone, who is the translator for the Italian version of the Governance of China, if I'm not mistaken, she translated the first 2 volumes. She wrote an article on that, describing her experience, basically. And it was extremely interesting, because she explained the way in which the first round of the translation, so the first draft was committed, she was asked to do it, and then the Chinese officials intervened, making modification, changes, and so on, according to their own view. And she wasn't allowed to speak about the changes they decided to make. So it's a very top-down control process, I would say, and there are specific offices within the propaganda system to take care of them.
Can I add one thing about that? So historians talk about translingual practice to refer to Lydia Leo's book, to refer to how certain terms and keywords, older keywords, have grown up and developed in conversation, discursive conversation between different languages. So one classic example is the idea of barbarian. And the British got very upset because they thought they were being called barbarians. And a case could be made that they were being called E, but E can also mean foreign, maybe not barbarian. And so, and the idea of Chinese versus barbarian, that being so, such a strong distinction in Chinese culture, in a way arose from that historical event of the British going in their first meetings and the idea of the tribute system and everything else. I don't want to give you a whole lecture on that, but the word China itself, as I mentioned before, is a word that has developed through this kind of process. It's from the Qin, the first dynasty, filtered through Sanskrit, then through various other languages, and then entering Latin and Persian and other things like that, and then being taken up as a word for China at a time when there was the Mongol Empire or the Yuan dynasty or the Ming dynasty, but there was no generic term like that. That term, of course, has become very, very important in the modern national age, right? To talk about all of China through all time, all of these things which we call dynasties. You can now lump them all together as China, as opposed to being umpteen different states, right? So one example of how this works more recently, and one thing we forget, it's less important now, but that a lot of this translation and this joint process of creating keywords originally was between Russian and Chinese, right, in the early decades of PRC, and at one point started flipping, obviously, right? And so the word nationality or ethnicity for the Chinese word minzu, which is what they call the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Chinese Muslims, all the different ethnic groups, or we call them minorities, right? That used to be translated as nationality from Russian in accordance with the Soviet system. Latvian nationality, would that be nacionalnica? Was that the word that was used in the Soviet period? Anyway, so leave that show. Anyway, so around 20 years ago, the PRC stopped translating the Chinese word minzu as nationality and started translating it as ethnicity. And in the English language website of the Chinese Nationalities Committee, which is the principal body that deals with this, and actually now the new head of this is on the standing committee, one of the top 7, they changed it from Nationalities Committee to ethnicity or ethnic committee, like this. And that matched a change of approach to these issues, which was mimicking the European and particularly the American approach, and saying, well, America has all of these ethnic groups and they don't get special political status or special regions, so China should be that way too, and this will promote melting and mingling, like is what they imagined happened in the United States, right? So the translation can signal an epical policy change, whereas the term itself never changed in Chinese. But the translation changed, matching this change in policy. And there, other places. Yes. Yeah.
There are no. If no one has other questions, I'd like to ask the last one. Is there anyone who wants to ask? No. So I have a question for all of you, actually, because a few days or perhaps a couple of weeks ago, there was this newspaper article, perhaps it was on the Financial Times, saying that basically the wolf warrior diplomacy is over. A signal of this was the replacement of key wolf warriors like Zhao Lijian. But recently, given especially Qinggang, so the press conference where the Chinese foreign minister talked again, some scholars abroad started saying, oh, perhaps the wolf warrior diplomacy is still there. It's not over. And people who also who used to be not believed to be wolf warrior, like Qinggang himself, he used to be the Chinese ambassador in the US. He was not among the wolf warriors, starting being wolf warrior too. So my question is, do you think that this is over? This kind of approach also with in terms of communication, or do you think there's just a continuity for what Qinggang said?
Okay, because I would like to probably they are connected, because I would like to go back to the issue of Taiwan, and especially the U.S. approach to that and China's perception of it. There are two schools of thought about the U.S. approach to China right now. One is that the U.S. policy-making community, foreign policy establishment has fallen into groupthink, and they cannot but frame China in antagonistic terms, because they believe that is what they are supposed to do in terms of domestic political returns. And also because they perhaps actually believe that the only way to respond to China's growing, China's rise, China's growing economic development and growth is to put a break on it. Another school of thought, which is not entirely, which is not mutually exclusive, is that the Biden administration in particular is perhaps acting a bit on this kind of groupthink, but at the core, especially with regard to Taiwan, they are acting on the assumption that China has taken the decision that before she leaves office, the Taiwan issue will be resolved. And therefore, they are trying to shape the policy opportunity structure of the Xi government in such a way that war is averted, including by playing hardball. So what would your reading of this be?
Quickly on the wolf warriors, and then we have an American in the room, so I would say that perhaps the style is out the door. Calling someone bitch on Twitter perhaps is not something we're going to see coming out of the Chinese diplomacy in the next few years, but the assertiveness will stay. The pushing back, the turning the tables, we're going to see more and more of that, and it's not going to be Zhao Lijian, it's going to be even more senior figures.
So it's useful to point out, I think, that the U.S. used to be more wolfish in its rhetoric, or simply obnoxious in its rhetoric under the Trump administration, right? I mean, outright racism. And I think that some of the wolf warrior excesses may have been simply them copying the kinds of things they were hearing from Mike Pompeo or from Trump himself, just calling people bitch on Twitter, right? That was like the style. And so, and I think similarly, the Biden administration has backed away from some of that rhetorical excesses, and maybe some of the gratuitous rhetorical excesses, which get you nothing but alienate your adversary. But I think in terms of policies, and this is a key point to remember with regard to the Taiwan issue, in terms of policies, the Biden administration has not backed off from much of the aggressive approach of the latter couple of years of the Trump administration. To the contrary, right? They've sounded much stronger notes about Taiwan. They didn't do anything about the tariffs on imports from China, $350 billion worth of imports that now have these tariffs, which I thought should have been one of the first things they did if they wanted to have some kind of a reset, because that's hurting American consumers as much as anyone in China. And they didn't do that. One of the reasons that they haven't done that, I think, is the other aspect about the Taiwan issue and the China issue generally in the US, which is that it's a domestic political issue. And I would say even more than groupthink, obviously the foreign policy establishment is thinking about China, the military establishment is thinking about China all the time, right? But in general public and in political discourse, they're talking about China, but they're thinking about the other party, like, right? Biden, their folks are thinking, how can we avoid being called soft on China? The Republicans are thinking, how can we turn this balloon into something we can use to damage the Biden administration? And I read something recently which I think is true, that the US talks about China and is thinking about the US. When China talks about the US, it's thinking about the US. In other words, it's the strategic relationship internationally for China. In the US, 3/4 of the time, it's a domestic issue. And I think this is very dangerous and very and unfortunate. And there's a lot of things that could be done just to find the floor in US-China relations, or to send out some signals that might, without throwing Taiwan under the bus, that might prevent a completely disastrous war from happening. And the US administration currently has missed many opportunities to make those sorts of gestures.
Yeah, maybe something small. I mean, I think it reiterates just how important it is that we start talking to each other again and not just about each other. And to the warfare diplomacy, I just checked I have a personal archive of Hua Chunying's Twitter posts and pictures. I mean, certainly warfare diplomacy is not gone. I have here 10 reasons why China won't become the US, and how the US has benefited from the Ukraine crisis. And just the last one, why the US is the world's biggest spy empire, 10 facts. So certainly it's not gone. And of course, I mean, Zhao Lijian has been removed. I heard actually it probably has to do something with his wife, who posted something. Jokes aside, I think we can expect a much more multi-layered approach, especially since now China is reopening and personal interactions are restarted. And just from the German context, what I keep hearing from, like I say, from political foundations in Beijing, that now kind of the Chinese side basically wants to link to where they stopped during the Merkel era. Is that we had such a wonderful cooperation for 16 years, can't we just continue that? While at the same time, there's this really sharp rhetoric towards the United States. So it's probably going to be much more multi-layered and much more nuanced, but again, probably also depending on, like, Germany is now, it seems, about to pass a ban on Huawei and ZTE for 5G. So it will depend probably a lot on what happens within Europe.
Hi, I am Ornella Orlando from Ministry of Economics and Finance, the Italian Economics and Finance Ministry. And now I'm working in the Office of Multilateral Development Banks, specifically African Development Bank. My question is about your opinion. I probe it because you are so important speakers, about your opinion about Italy-China relations at the moment, because we know that beside this political approach about Taiwan, Ukraine parallelism, about these two area of contrast, China represents in economic fundamental counterpart for our country. So do you think that Italy is losing the possibility to have a good economic independent relation with China, or just our country is losing this possibility because of the special relations with USA government? Because the fact that we know, for example, I read about this comprehensive agreement on investment signed in December 2020 by European institution and China, you know very well more than me, and blocked because of problems related to European Parliament approval. But I think there was another reason above this. And you think that Italy is losing the possibility to have an independent approach, because China represents a fundamental stakeholder. So now, which is the point about this? Thank you.
Should I answer? Yeah. The CAI, Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, was an agreement between the European Union and China. So if the European Union act united towards China, I think it's not bad for Italy, nor it is for other European countries. It was frozen for the Xinjiang issue, basically, and for the sanctions that tit for tat sanctions that first Europe, sorry, when Europe sanctioned the Chinese officials conceived as responsible for the human rights violation in Xinjiang, and then China replied with other sanctions against also members of the European Parliament, scholars and think tanks and so on. There was a good reason why this agreement was frozen, even though it's not good for the economic relations between Europe and China. But we should never forget that this was an agreement at the European level, not at the level of Italy-China relations. When it comes to the economic relations between China and Italy, well, we can see that since the Draghi administration and also the current government is using a kind of tough but at the same time somehow pragmatic approach. I mean, the bilateral meeting between Wang Yi, the head of Chinese diplomacy at the moment, and the Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani did quite good. I mean, it was the tone was not so tough in the bilateral meeting. And acting united with other European countries and with Europe when it comes to also economic relation, I don't think it's going to be bad for Italy. I'm not sure whether we are going to see any changes at the level of Europe-China relations, but acting united with Europe, I think it's not bad for Italian-China relations. We will see whether we are going to renew the memorandum of understanding with China or not, and whether it will bring any benefit, because so far, perhaps due to the pandemic or other reasons, in terms of the economic benefit that the Italian gained from this agreement, there weren't so. But there's still discussion on whether it stop the renew. So I don't know whether I answered your question. Sure, I don't think that the Italian government, as well as other European countries' government, are willing to stop the economic relations at all. Sure. No, I don't see any willingness to stop them at all. Even though they are being tough at the political level somehow. But China always, I mean, this wouldn't be the first case where you have cold politics and hot economics. It's the basic paradigm for China and for the relations between China and other Asian countries, for instance. For China and United States, for instance, yeah.
I thought it might be worth adding something, from a perspective of a country who is highly interlinked with China, coming from Germany, where we now have a huge debate about what the high dependency on China and the interlinking actually means. And when we talk about high dependency on the EU level, we talk about that we are depending on critical resources and rare earth, I think, to 98% or something like that. And all the, if you talk about German global players like the BASF, with the gas prices rising, the BASF did not make any profit in Europe. So all the profit it would have made was eaten up by the gas prices. The only two places where they are making profit are the United States and China. But then the question is, not only for BASF, but also for Volkswagen and for the others, how much of the profit they are making in China actually feeds back into the German or the European economy? Maybe not that much. So the question is, should the government then provide investment guarantees? Because German companies basically had to leave their stakes in Russia. So that was all written off. If Taiwan happens, that could happen as well. The other question is that we realize that we are highly dependent for critical goods, not only masks, but medicine, like all antidepressants produced in Wuhan. So if something, we had shortage of critical goods. So I understand kind of, that you're talking about maybe, we should expand our relationship with China, but from a perspective of a country that is highly interlinked, we are just now understanding how huge the risks are and how much it is going us to cost to disentangle everything. Because if we want to reduce risks and to increase resilience, we have to. And this is a debate about risks we should have been having 20 years ago and not now. So in a way, kind of, maybe you have the chance to avoid the mistakes Germany did.
If I may add something here, I don't think that no one, either in Europe or even in the United States, really think that economic decoupling is an option. The point is about reducing vulnerabilities that are intrinsic to interdependence. And Marina has just spoken about specific vulnerabilities concerning rare earth and other products that are based on rare earth or on supply chains based in China. You don't know about antidepressants being mostly produced in Wuhan. So it is kind of a challenge. It is about investment screening. It is about which is reducing your vulnerability to the political influence that comes with investment. And it's about reducing the technology outreach of Chinese companies. 5G produced by Huawei, for instance. But now the United States, the Biden administration has really stepped up the whole fight, because last October they introduced this massive technology export controls, which basically would make it impossible for any US company, and actually for any company in the world, to export to China elements that have some sort of US imprint on it. in the advanced chip sector. And the deliberate objective is to keep China's technological development, at least on semiconductors, back by what, 10 years? Which is, I mean, can you just imagine what would happen if the Chinese came out publicly and saying our goal is to keep America's technological development back by 10 years? I mean, it would be, I mean, I'm just thinking about it right now. I mean, what the response would be. Yeah. So reducing vulnerabilities and containing China, I mean, the distinction between these two things are becoming increasingly blurred. China is not helping. Cold politics and hot economics is definitely what we are going to have to deal with. But I wouldn't underestimate the possibility that cold politics, contrary to what the conventional wisdom was for many, many years, could trump economics. Because we are, I mean, this is no longer about, a piecing context. This is really about the fundamental elements of one country's economic growth prospect. And the United States saying this is dangerous for us. And therefore, we have to put a brake on China's development. At least we should not contribute to that. The second part of the proposition may be somewhat legitimate, but again, if you reverse the whole thing and think about what the U.S. response would be, I even think that China has been pretty restrained on the export control issue, much more than on the Taiwan issue.
Are there other questions? If not, I'd like to thank you again for being here today with us, and thank you again. Have a nice day, and we are going to have a light lunch now. Thank you.